so we should be recording there. So Nick is going to carry on doing that. So I'm just going to do a brief introduction. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Pen Rashbass. I'm the Peak District area facilitator. I also sit on the research group. And what we've got tonight, and I'm chairing tonight's session, and what we've got, I'm really pleased to say, is a session on working successfully with your vet. So I said, as you'll have noticed, we're recording this session. So to minimize noise, can you keep your microphones on mute unless you're actually asking a question or making a comment? And what we've done is I've sort of put in the on the forum, and I think it also came out in the newsletter yesterday, is that the tonight's session is actually going to be in two parts. The first is with Claire and Dan, and I'm just going to introduce them in a minute. And then at 8 o'clock, we're going to be joined by Martin Jenkins from DEFRA Future Farming Team, and he's going to give a brief presentation and then answer your questions on the new Animal Health and Welfare Path review that's going to start, be rolled out in the next few weeks. But first, let's go to Claire and Dan. You can see them on the screen as LM Farm Vets. They are based both at Whitchurch. They're a busy farm vet practice, and they work with all types of farm livestock and all farm systems. So no matter whether you're fully regenerative or agroecology and organic, or whether you're highly conventional and still feeding, well, we'll just say highly conventional systems, more they'll be used to working with you. And what we're going to do is, because it's PFL, we're going to really just focus on animal health and welfare of beef and dairy cows and sheep. If you do have pigs and poultry questions, I'm sure they could ask them, but we probably save that for another day. That we're all keen for this session to be as interactive as possible. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand or somehow make yourself known to me, and I'll bring you forward to ask your questions, or I will voice your questions from the chat if you don't want to, if you want to remain hidden and don't want to be seen on the recording, but still want your views to come across. And I think that's about it. So Claire and Dan, as I say, are busy farm vets. I'll let them come in and give a brief introduction from you, and then we'll get going. Dan, Claire, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pen. Thank you for inviting us, and thank you to everybody, attendee-wise, for coming and listening to us. My name's Dan Stevenson. Been a farm vet for nearly 20 years, and as Pen says, work with predominantly cattle and sheep. Claire was having a little snigger as I said 20 years, because she probably thinks it's a lot longer than that. Pen asked us if we wanted to do a presentation or if we wanted to do a question and answer sort of session, and possibly stupidly, Claire and I thought question and answers and a discussion would be good. That might leave us open to all sorts of controversy and questions we can't answer, but we thought we would risk that. We do have some subjects we can talk around if you guys would like, but we thought the opportunity to have an audience like yourselves, forward-thinking farmers, to ask farm vets questions about why we do stuff or how we do stuff or how we might see our role developing in the future. We thought that was too good an opportunity to miss, really.
Hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Claire. I've only been a vet for 8 years. Not that matter too much, but yeah, we're Dan. So we do quite a lot of dairy cattle here in sort of Whitchurch, Shropshire is where we're based. So Staffordshire, North Wales, we cover as well. I think I've seen you guys, some of you, obviously I do quite a lot of chat about dung beetles generally, and a lot about poo, which is my favourite subject. But yeah, so it's about broadening, about thinking about the vet's role, what sort of it was historically in terms of sort of sticking plasters on things, and potentially firefighting a little bit more, moving towards preventative management. So yeah, if you guys have got any questions, please feel free to fire away. There's certain subject areas we thought we might be able to discuss. So just to give you some ideas, we've got some stuff about minerals, obviously integrated parasite control, a little bit about disease and natural ecosystems and what that might mean for sort of your herds and flocks. But yeah, if any of you have any questions you want to kick off with, we're obviously very keen to hear. Otherwise, we can kick into a bit about disease. Anyone, any burning questions? I can't even see.
Dog on my hook. So shall we start? You said you said you've got something on disease and ecosystems. Shall we start there and then maybe move on to parasites and minerals? Would that work for you?
Yeah, that's good. And if anyone
Start
just
there and just see what, and as I say, other people come in, put stuff in the chat or indicate with raising your hand. But let's start it off going with disease and ecosystems then.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe a bit of background while Claire's getting that up, because both Claire and I would have been very conventionally taught at university, looking at disease reasonably simplistically. But as both of us have gone through our careers and learned more, we've realised that things, as ever, are a lot more complicated than we're perhaps taught at university. And there's a massive interaction of things. And so that has led both Claire and I to pursue a different way of looking at things. So whilst we'd still deal with very conventional farmers, we would probably look at things in a more holistic way and look at what root causes are. In university, we'd be very much taught that you get very good at identifying diseases and knowing what the causative bacteria or the causative virus of that disease is and what the best antibiotic is, for example. And that's how you're encouraged to complete your exams. Whereas we all know life is a lot more complicated than that. And what Claire and I try and do, and you guys will have very varied experiences of vets within your own farming systems. But what Claire and I try and do is look at what those diseases are telling us and what the underlying problems and how we might correct those in a more sort of holistic, long-term way. So this is a sort of presentation we did a little while ago, looking at what disease tells us and what it tells us about the wider ecosystem and sort of health of the animals and health of the farm.
Yeah, so I just point out I am looking slightly upwards. Our camera's sort of up at the top of the screen that we're looking at, so apologies if we're not looking directly at you. But yeah, so what can disease tell us about disease? What can disease tell us in pasture-fed systems, basically? And we had a question for you guys put out there, which we'd be really keen to hear your answers. Is zero disease a realistic expectation in a pasture-fed livestock system? And we had some interesting responses to this. We presented this at Groundswell last year, and there was various views, but if you guys have anything you'd like to share, please do pop it in the chat box and Ken will be able to give us those questions as they come out. So a little bit about disease in natural ecosystems. So what do we mean by an ecosystem? So the Oxford Dictionary definition of an ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms with their physical environment. And for me, that's effectively what I'm saying when we're talking about farming systems. You know, a biological community is the key. So if we're thinking about farms as ecosystems, that's from the people that work on the farm, to the plants, to the soil, to the livestock there, the wildlife. And very often these things, again, Dan said, talking about things in isolation, we would do that with those various components of our farms. But when we start thinking about ecosystems and how they interact, I guess we start thinking about how disease is actually a normal part of that. So obviously none of us want disease in our livestock, both from a health and a welfare perspective. But maybe it's not possible all the time. I'm not sure if it is. And that's what we would like to discuss. We're learning all the time, and the experiences that you guys have with disease on your farm as an ecosystem. Obviously, you can help us make us some better decisions as vets when we come out and work with you guys as well. So talking about it being an integral part of a healthy ecosystem, many of the viruses, the parasites, the microbes, the infections have been around longer, or at least as long as the organisms that they infect. And infectious diseases can affect individual organisms, they can affect populations, they can affect communities, and they can also affect ecosystems. They can impair their host, they can kill their host, but they are common and they are integral. And whilst not all infections can cause disease, those that do can have pretty severe effects. So sometimes you can get mass mortalities of particular hosts over quite wide areas. You can get disease outbreaks that can be episodic in nature, or they can be sustained over really long periods of time. It's not a fixed outcome often. It results in these interactions between, you've got your parasite, you've got your host, and then you've got the environment as well. And then if we do experience something like a mass mortality event, the disease often reaches the end of its life cycle and other species thrive in their place. So ecosystems change all of the time, and in response to the environment. So how do we manage that in favour of the animals that are on our farms?
So we already have a couple of questions coming in, which will come on to this. And one is, do you see less disease in pasture fed systems, because sometimes the animals are under less pressure. And then Nikki has come back to say that on response to that she actually puts her animals under more pressure, because she's looking for a strong selection to select out the weaker animals.
Yeah, well, that's quite a nice sort of question and response that flows into this slide, isn't it, in many ways?
Yeah.
And so we can answer perhaps the first part of that question. In certain circumstances, we will see less disease in a pasture-based system, but then we'll also see more of other certain diseases, or a greater effect or a more catastrophic effect of certain pressures. So an example of that might be, we might see more eye disease in a pasture-based system. We could see more lameness in certain pasture-based systems, depending on what the disease pressure is. And that relates really to this point, and building up what Claire was saying, and also feeds into what you were saying as well. So all of these diseases are that balance between host response, wider environmental pressures, and the pressure of the pathogen. And our job in any of these systems, and our jobs in vets, is to try and stack things in favour of the animal, however that may be. And so balancing those pressures, and that may be when we see more disease in a pasture-based system, because those scales have flipped too far the other way. And if we're not using our observation skills, and Penn, when we chatted earlier in the week, we were saying about a big part of our approach to this type of system is observations and interpreting what we're seeing. If we're not interpreting those signs early, then things can very quickly shift the other way, and we can see far worse disease. I'm not sure if that totally answers the question, Penn, and then it sort of flows into the resistance, resilience, and genetically sort of optimum.
Well, I'm certainly very interested in resistance and resilience, and certainly in terms of parasite control, because I'm one who would much rather breed for resilience than resistance. But you know, I know with people pushing for FECs, they're more building for resistance. So I'd also be very interested in your take on that.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing I just wanted to add to what Dan was saying, management actually has a huge role to play there as well. So in terms of any system that you have, the management of that system is really important when it comes to both health and welfare. So even you could have a very, you could have quite an intensive conventional dairy system, where you could, you know, where you see the health levels or health as we would see it is very good, and then you could have a very extensive pasture-based system where it's not so good, and often management plays quite a big role in there as well. And I think, yeah, in terms of observation, as Dan was saying as well, and well, Dan, we can talk about some of those observations, what we look at. So for things like eye disease, how to pick up early on infection. We've got a few slides on there as well, and Penn will come on to your, I think definitely when we talk about resistance and resilience and talking about breed of animal, I think somebody said about having the right animal in the right system is really, really important. Genetic selection, all of those kind of things. So yeah, popping a Holstein into a fully pasture-based system might not be the ideal thing to do, but thinking about our breeds and how they, and particularly native breeds and things like that, how they respond to local environments. And then in terms of that parasite pressure is really important.
Yeah, on the resistance and resilience front, and then that very first question is, disease or no disease a realistic expectation? Looking at some of the comments there, it isn't, and it also is not what we want. So disease pressure is not necessarily a bad thing, and striving for a lack of disease pressure would actually result in probably a population of animals with minimal resilience. And that, Penn, is building on your point as well. The difference between resistance and resistance being the ability of an animal to actually fight and eradicate an infection, resilience being the ability of that animal to thrive in the presence of it. I would say a lot of the time resilience is really what we should be striving for, and there's many things that play into that to do with the balance of the ecosystem, as Claire talked about.
Well, that's one of the issues I've got, because I don't have sheep lame. I mean, I'm quite chuffed. I don't have sheep lameness anymore. I know that I've removed the bacteria. I've had Warwick University come out, and they've done PCRs on the feet and the mouths, and they've shown there's not there. But that means I don't have any ability now to maintain that resilience in my flock, because they've got no pressure there to do it. So I have very few lame sheep. If they do it, it's normally that they've had some injury or some other reason. but I don't know now when I sell them on to other people whether they're still going to be resilient to foot rot when they go onto the new farm.
It's an interesting one, that, Pen, isn't it? And I think it comes down to, I mean, thinking about your own flock as well, talking about things like breeding your own replacements. So having your own replacements from your own animals that are resilient in your system is probably the most important thing. And that's, again, really important when we talk about parasite control. So when we talk about resilience in adult animals, for example, so I often talk about mature animals historically have been wormed quite frequently. As long as an animal has been on your farm and had at least 2 grazing seasons on your farm with your parasites, in theory, they should have enough resilience to not require worming in the future. But that has to be 2, I mean, and this season has thrown us off a little bit, hasn't it? Because we say 2 grazing seasons. What we mean is 2 summers effectively outside, they should be resilient. But what we've had this year with the change in weather patterns is we've had a very, very dry summer. And then a very wet, so say November, I think around here we started getting pretty wet. So actually the animals and their second year of grazing hadn't come across parasites until later on in the season. So actually some of those second and even third year grazing animals have been struggling a little bit when it comes around to November, when they, you know, their immunity has probably waned slightly because they've not had that parasite burden early on in the season. So thinking again, it's not the same thing every year. Particularly with parasites, and we've had it with fluke as well. So fluke's been a very low level, low risk year for fluke. And normally this time of year we'd be talking about doing things like fecal egg counting for fluke. That would be in a standard year. But actually, if it was November when it got wet and you need adult fluke to produce eggs, they need to be at least 12 weeks. So if it was November, actually, if we're doing fecal egg counts for fluke now, it might not be the right time. So something like a copper antigen test will be better on fecal samples. So working with your vet as well to think about the disease, the dynamics of disease and how that changes year on year. And we're probably going to see many more changes on that as well. Lungworm will be another. I mean, when Dan and I were at university, it was considered this sort of late summer disease. But now I know we've seen lungworm as early as March. When I had an outbreak in November in a herd last year as well, which is something that, again, it's something we've not really seen before. Sorry, I've gone off a bit there.
Well, I just wanted to throw a potentially confounding comment in. We talk about resilience, and Pen, your example of lameness resilience is a really good one. We do want some resistance as well, and the parasite example is brilliant for that. So a resilient animal can carry a burden of parasites and still perform, but in doing so, she's also harboring that infection and potentially contaminating the pasture for less resilient animals, whereas a resistant animal will quash that parasite burden and so will not be contributing towards a contamination of the pasture. So you do want a balance of both. You want an animal that is capable of thriving in the face of disease challenge, but equally an animal that is also capable of getting rid of an infection. So salmonella being a great example. You can have salmonella carrier animals that will never look bad or ill and can be very difficult to identify, or salmonella animals that have excreted and got rid of that infection, not to carry it again and resistant to future infections. So we've sort of presented those 2 terms there as being important, and they are, but it isn't perhaps as clear cut as sometimes we might view it, that resilience is the one thing we strive for in these sorts of systems, when resistance is important too.
No, that's great. So you've got here on the last slide, but you've got how we can help. So as vets, oh, you've gone on to your next slide. You've got, no, go on to your next slide. As vets, I was going to say how, you know, or are you coming on to that later?
I'll go on to this next. So this just talking about disease, and then what things we can do to help as vets as well. So talking about disease and biodiversity loss. So a lot of the research on biodiversity loss around the world has been associated with human health. Obviously people aren't quite so interested when it comes to animal health. However, there is a dual role of biodiversity loss, because high biodiversity potentially means there's a larger source of novel pathogens. However, there was a really good review done by Keating et al. You can find it at the bottom. It was in the Nature Journal. And that looked at the impacts of biodiversity on the emergence and transmission of infectious diseases. Now, this is in human medicine, but the review found that since 1940, over half of the 300 emerging infections in humans have been due to increased rates of human activity. And what that human activity is due to changes in land use, due to changes in agricultural or food production practices. So to give you an example, Nipah virus in fruit bats, it had a spillover into pigs in Malaysia. Now, what that was thought to be, and there was human cases, unfortunately, there was mortality as well, but that was thought to be associated with changes in agricultural land use, where we had bigger and bigger pig farms moving into spaces which they wouldn't normally have been in. So you get increased contact then with fruit bat colonies. And then you get these high densities of pigs on intensive farms, and then you get pig-to-pig transmission of disease, and then unfortunately that spill over into humans as well. So it found basically that if you preserve intact ecosystems, that prevents the entry of novel diseases entering or exiting. So if you go back to thinking of your farm as an ecosystem, one of the best ways of protecting your livestock is always going to be biosecurity. And I hate to use that term because it sounds very vetty. But having management tools in place, so things like basic quarantine protocols for animals joining your herd or your flock to prevent the introduction of these diseases, and resistant parasites as well. So again, worming, I'm not, obviously I don't like to worm where possible, but if there is any time to worm, it's when you're bringing animals to join your herd or your flock, to make sure that you're not bringing resistant parasites onto your farm. I've seen many problems with that. And vaccination could play a role here too as well. So speaking to your vets where you're at, not everybody agrees with vaccination, and I totally get that, but it can be a very important management tool, particularly during the transition period, if you have open herds or open flocks as well. And also thinking about visitors to your farm. So I don't know if any of you have machinery coming on, or even people, but a lot of our infectious diseases, so things like IBR, for example, in cattle, they're fomites. That basically means they stick to stuff, so they stick to people, and they can be carried really, really long distances. So are people disinfecting on and off your farm? What are your boundaries like? Do your animals have nose-to-nose contact with neighbouring livestock? All of those kind of things. And you can work with your vet there to develop those protocols. And then if we talk, just moving on to, oh, hang on, I'm just going to switch down a bit. I know I haven't put it in. I've missed one. But basically talking about biodiversity for animal health and welfare, and again working with your vet on it, so things like hedgerows and trees. So a hedgerow is a perfect biosecure boundary. So a proper hedgerow should be around about 3 meters at the base. We want animals to be 3 meters apart, so it's perfect for biosecurity. It's a living biosecure fencing effectively. So you, instead of having just 2 fences 3 meters apart, you've got these lovely hedges. They also provide shelter in wind and rain. For young animals as well, they can be really important. So we often talk about a thermoneutral zone in animals. Now in cattle, that's anywhere from, so cows, it's the temperatures at which cows are able to carry on producing without expending any extra energy. So for cows, that can be right down to -15 degrees. They're perfectly happy, up to about 21. Now for young animals, that's less than 10 degrees. So things like hedgerows can provide that extra shelter when we need it. And obviously, you've got your shelter, you've got your biosecurity, and you've got your browse as well. So in terms of tannins and things, so tannins in wood are really, really good for reducing that the ability of parasites to complete their life cycle. So if cows have access to trees, they can that can be beneficial as well. That varied diet in terms of nutrition, so pasture fed systems with lots of different grasses and things. And then parasite management, so herbal lays are great as well. When we talk about parasites, where we've got mixed species in grasses, worm eggs are less able to climb up those stalks and less likely to be eaten by our cattle or by our sheep, compared to ryegrass, where we often find worm egg counts throughout the grazing horizon. And then mineral supplementation, so obviously things like cobalt. So we talk, sorry, I realise I'm going off a bit on one, but things like willow trees, for example. So willow has actually really high levels of cobalt, and the cobalt levels in willow tend to go up in the spring, summer when it's dropping actually in our pasture. So having things like willow in the system can be really important for mineral supplementation as well. And we also know like things like iodine. So there's higher levels of iodine on lichens on trees than there ever is in grass. So just giving cattle access to that, but thinking a little bit differently about how we provide minerals, how we do our flock and health planning, but biosecurity, vaccination, all those things can be important. Sorry, Ben.
So that kind of answers the question that the iPhone has put in, whoever iPhone is, of does the varied diet in pasture-fed livestock increase general disease resilience? And because of that, and that may well be partly through the mineral levels and maybe other phytochemicals as well, because we're knowing increasingly that the varied phytochemicals in pasture-based diet, which we're having a webinar on in February, is increased, and the phytochemical range in meat is increased. So it's in the animals. It might not come through to humans, but it gets certainly as far as the animals. And so they've got antioxidants, and they've got anti-cancer versions, and as well as the vitamins and minerals that we always look at. So they've got that general health status.
Definitely, I think that area actually needs a lot more work. So we know, for example, that obviously your pasture-fed meats have higher omega-3s. So omega-3 is really good for people, but we don't necessarily know what that means from an animal's perspective. We would assume it's good, but there's definitely more research that can be done there. But in terms of things like microbial interactions, obviously the more varied diet you get, you're going to have different microbial interactions. And we talk about the resilience of the rumen as well. We don't know that much about that system, but in terms of what well, I'm going to let Dan say it. What he says about the rainbow.
Yes, that is exactly what I was going to say. So the last point on the iPhone contribution there is probably my biggest takeaway message that I'm currently banging on about, and it's exactly as Claire says. We're told as humans, aren't we, all the time, to eat a rainbow, to eat a varied diet, to eat 30 different species of plant and nut and all of these sorts of things. Yet we very rarely, and I appreciate we're talking to a subset of you guys who would be a long way along this journey compared to many clients we might deal with, but we don't view it in the same way with animals. And so even many of our pasture-reared animals are fed ryegrass, and just ryegrass and variations on ryegrass, which is not eating a rainbow. And so the mixed species swards, and I'd be really interested to know what you guys are feeding in that sort of context, as well as trees, hedgerows, all of these things provide that rainbow. And by taking minerals from different layers in the soil and the bedrock and bringing things up from there, we are complementing, as Claire says, cobalt in willow, complementing low cobalt in grass is a brilliant example of that if they have access to those things. And I would definitely agree that by a varied diet, we will I can't see how we cannot increase resilience to disease, plus a load of other benefits like epigenetic benefits that is a whole topic on its own through that varied diet. So I entirely agree with iPhone and its own.
Nikki's got her hand up. Do you want to come in, Nikki, and say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on that point about the diversity in the diet. And I was at a conference back in December, and there was some brilliant research being done at Teagasc in Ireland. I say brilliant because it was really great that they were doing this, but it was fascinating how they took this kind of all or nothing approach. So there's a PhD researcher who's looking into the methane inhibition benefits of feeding willow. So you hear that and you think that's brilliant. Yeah, love that idea. Really interested in the benefits of silver pasture. Obviously, it's one of my kind of pet subjects. I think I love it as much as Claire loves poo. But it was really interesting that they decided just to feed willow. So they were putting dairy young stock on willow fields that were being grown for biomass in the interim years between the biomass harvesting, and that was all that the cattle had to access. Now, obviously, this was for a research, purposes, and so they needed to kind of make sure that they understood the impacts of what was happening. But it's really fascinating how, because of the reductionist nature of research, we end up with these kind of all or nothing swards or all or nothing diet options, and then that makes it really difficult to kind of really understand the benefits of the diversity. And I quite often find that a lot of farmers that I work with want kind of prescriptions. They're like, tell me what to put in my sward, without any of us really understanding that the benefit of the diversity is actually greater than the sum of its parts. It's not just about having bird's foot trefoil because it's high in tannins, or having, and also, reduces the risk of bloat as well as being a legume, but then also having some yarrow and also having some, all of those things are amazing, but it's when they come together as a diverse feed that they kind of really shine.
But it's also
yeah.
the fact that too much, you know, that's also the question with things like they've done those similar sort of experiments with plantain in terms of giving them 100% diet, and it's not understanding. If you think about the work that's been done recently with clover, and the idea that red clover, because of work done 50 years ago on sheep in New Zealand, where they put them on 100% red clover, you had those fertility problems where all the sheep farmers say we can't put our sheep on red clover. But then there's been the innovative farmers study where they only have 10 to 30% red clover, and now the benefit to the animal is much better. And so it's not having too high a concentration. It's the Goldilocks situation, isn't it? It's not too much and not too much, but just right. That you need, and it's that mix. But to also sort of throw it in the mix, I do a lot of conservation grazing, and one of the sites a number of the sites I graze on, you know, it's got high diversity, you know, maybe 150, 160 different plants, but my animals become desperate for the mineral bucket. You know, when on my own land, which isn't anywhere near as diverse as these, you know, we're gradually getting there, but it's nowhere near as diverse as some of these other sites. But their need for particular minerals, maybe it's just salt, but their need on the mineral bucket goes right up.
Yeah, that really interesting point, Penny. It sort of reminds me of one of my favourite stories that talked about animals being far cleverer than we are and choice being important. And I'm loath to open a can of worms, but bear with me on the story. So one of our vets worked in an Australian university for a long time. And they had a hospital where they get a lot of inpatients in, and they dealt with a lot of individual animals, which they admitted as inpatients. We wouldn't really do that in this country. That was a benefit of a teaching facility. And then around the university campus, they grew all sorts of different trees. And when they got these sick goats or sheep in, they would take a load of blood samples off them and run them for a variety of different things. And they go and harvest a load of browse from around the campus and bring all of these different hedgerows and trees back into the hospital pen. And before they got the results of the blood samples back, they knew exactly what they were going to be based on which of those plants those sick animals went for to replace the minerals they were deficient in. And I think that just tells us an awful lot about them knowing what they are in need of and knowing how to replace it. And it sort of takes you back to animals that would have walked for miles across great grass plains, and they would go and search out different areas at different times of the year, including, and we've got some photos if anyone's interested, including areas of bare soil that they would go and lick at certain times of the year and all of that sort of thing. So there's an awful lot in there. And I think if our systems are able to replicate many of those things, then I think we're going a long way to optimizing their inherent resistance and resilience and disease. So
how do we? I mean, you know, I'm going to say I'm with LM Vets in Bakewell. I'm not with you, you know, so I'm with your practice, if you like, on a different practice. But how do people who don't have forward-thinking vets like you interact with their vet to try and encourage them to change, to see your viewpoint, if you like?
There's a lot of elements to that. There's a few things to unpack. So the first thing to say, and this sounds like a plug and it isn't a plug, is that you can, both Claire and I will deal with farmers all over the country who will use us for certain elements of their planning. So there is always that option. You can look for vets who maybe share your views in certain things. Another thing would be to start the conversations with them. I think sometimes vets are a bit guilty of thinking they know what clients want, but never asking them that. And then it can be the reverse as well. So it might be that your vet's there to help you when there's a disaster. And so you only view them in that context, and they think, well, those guys only want me for disasters. So sometimes just having that conversation about what you want from your vet, and then you can see if they can deliver it, I think is a really, really good starting point. And then you will often identify within your group of vets someone who's really keen. It is thinking a bit outside the box and not how we've conventionally been taught. And you know, we work in a very big practice of very good vets, but some of them will probably think you and I talk some rubbish at times, don't they?
I think so. One of the questions I always ask if you do any consultancy type work is actually trying to find out what you guys are trying to achieve. That's normally my first question, and I think that can be something that can be useful for you guys to share with your vet as well. So what you are trying to achieve on your farm, give them a bit of an overview. Obviously, giving them a bit of an overview of what you did. One of the ways I got really interested in this was being shown around a farm where somebody was doing really farming well alongside nature, and that's what kicked off my interest, and that's all it took. So I think, yeah, trying to take people along on your journey and what you want from your vet, I think often tell them tell them, and most people will be pleased here, but I've had to reframe how I think about it, because I wouldn't have asked that question previously, probably. Quite often because you're going on to solve a problem, where you're just constantly thinking about efficiency and productivity and how can you make the most out of animals. And I know a lot of you guys won't necessarily think that way. It's a bigger picture than just the animals on your farm, and letting your vet into that is really important as well. Most people want to be on vets like being outside, they like nature, all of those kind of things that, we do tend to love animals, all kinds.
That's great. So if we then move on to, we've sort of touched on the biodiversity, the disease, the nutrition, and how that can. Let's move on to another big thing which we have sort of touched on, but integrated. Oh, I've got some question here. On a different tack, are you able to include homeopathy in your herd health plan? Our vets refuse to recognise it, but it's always our first port of call if we see a health issue starting to develop. So what's your view on that?
We thought this potentially could come up. Are we allowed to? I don't think there's any reason we're not allowed to. We are taught incredibly conventionally, and that is a good thing in many respects, because it means that we scrutinise heavily everything we're going to do and going to recommend, and so that's how a lot of vets will think. So we can include that type of thing, but I don't know how many vets you would find, even amongst vets like Claire and I, that might see a problem and say, right, well, let's go back 5 steps and work out where that problem's come from. Even in our sort of smaller world, that might not necessarily be something we include. And often that's because we don't have a great knowledge of it. And
no, we don't have a great knowledge of it. My thought, I do like to, I think we still, homeopathy is still, for me, potentially a treatment. Now, I could be wrong, and some of you might think differently on that to me. But I think one of the things that we try and focus on is getting back to the root cause of what that problem is. So if you guys treat with homeopathy, obviously, yeah, that's totally your decision. And I've seen benefits to people doing things. And in terms of, do we talk about fly worry a lot, and using chemical treatments versus herbal or essential oils and things like that. So there's a lot of evidence that, for example, eucalyptus oil works really well for controlling flies in sheep. However, the study shows that you have to apply it every 4 hours. So realistically, and again, going back to how we've been trained, as Dan said, it is very conventional, but I'm keen to learn more about it. But as I say, for me, homeopathy as a treatment is not getting back to why is that disease actually happening in the first place? Where do we get to that point? And that for me is probably the most important.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? So Neil, Lottie, do one of you want to come on and comment about what you actually mean by homeopathy? Is it because, yeah, some people define it slightly differently. So do you want to come in and talk?
Yeah, I'm just trying to start. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Very good. So my understanding of homeopathy is that it's a treatment, yes, but it does get to the cause because it changes something within the animal, and we're quite new users of homeopathy. We're quite new farmers. We've only been here 4 years, and we found homeopathy has been really helpful, and it's something that you can't understand logically, but it just seems to work. And the way it's been explained to us is that you're addressing something at a cellular level within the animal, which you are changing. So you are addressing the cause in some way.
And it's not just, I mean, because again, for me, a lot of, again, it depends on whether you're talking about treatment and going back to root cause and observation and understanding, because sometimes you're doing these other changes. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm much more on the LM Vet Farm side of things, and considering things from wanting to get to the root problem and understand how we can adapt that, and also being very aware that the phytochemicals, the plant chemicals, are actually often very powerful medicines in themselves, as well as being nutritionally broad. And so I do sometimes wonder whether homeopathy is just giving the animal time to recover without intervening.
I think that's
Yeah.
some of my thoughts as well, is that so obviously what Pen was saying, so about the availability of things in plants, and again, it'd be really interesting to know more about what is actually available. We don't know. We've probably lost a lot of that over the years as well. We focus more on conventional medicine. And just from your vet's perspective, Neil and Lottie, there is a kind of we have to be very careful in terms of treatments that we advise as vets in the profession, is that we are using licensed treatments. And that's something that is unfortunately something that we do. Well, not unfortunately, it's great, as Dan said, in a lot of ways, but we do have to abide by those rules to a certain extent, because they are, they're the products that we have available. And that they
I
have a
suppose
license to use.
another key difference we found with homeopathy was, prior to using homeopathy, we'd see something was happening, we'd wait until it got really bad, and then we'd call the vet, and they would prescribe either antibiotics or a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, and then we'd give them that, and it either worked or didn't work, but by then it was kind of too late. So what it's given for us, well, what it's done for us is it means that we really observe the animals an awful lot closer. So we will really look at each animal every day and make sure there's nothing there, no signs of anything that we can see, and we're getting better now at knowing what might happen at certain times of the year, and we can then do something to address that before it gets to a critical stage. And it's drilled into you on the homeopathy course that you have to, the homeopathy can do certain amounts, but there is definitely a time to call the vet, and it doesn't replace the vet.
I think there's an important thing you said there, Neil, as well, about your observations improve, but then one of the things I think about waiting, so when you wait for something to get really bad, eat whatever drugs you then use, whether it's antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, will only have limited use. So getting your vet in early is obviously important in that perspective. But if homeopathy is helping you to focus more and observe your animals, that's really important. Hopefully Dan and I can cover some of the things that you can potentially look for, as well as some early warning signs, which might help.
I totally agree with the observation side of things, and it links into Pen's previous question. Well, how can you engage your vet? So the big change in mindset for me is, in that scenario, Neil, it might be, hello, Dan, I've got a load of really bad eyes. What's the best thing to treat it with? That isn't we can answer that question, but it isn't the relationship we want. Or somebody rings me up and goes, Dan, I've just noticed that we've got ever so slight weeping eyes on some more of these cattle. What do you think's going on? And then we start with the root cause of it, not ignoring the treatment. And as you said, Neil, as Claire says, it goes all the way back to observation and root cause, rather than just deep firefighting the end point. And that, I think, is how the mindset of utilising your vet in whatever system you're in needs to be adopted to get the most. And not all vets do think like that. I think lots would like to think they did, but a lot of the time it is the best antibiotic for such and such, best anti-inflammatory for such and such. But yeah, that is not where we want that relationship to be. So I think it's having, and I don't know if you do, Neil, if you have a relationship with a vet where you can ring them at that really early stage and talk through stuff without necessitating any visits or anything like that, but just talking stuff through. That is where we like to be with the clients that we work with in this sort of.
Nikki, you had your hand up. Sorry, with a conversation going on, so I didn't bring you in. Do you want to come back in and make a comment?
I was going to say exactly what Claire did, which was about the pointing to the point that Neil said about observation, and having had the conversation with Lawrence from Whole Health Ag, I was kind of highlighting that in the conversation with him at ORFC last week about, increased observation. And I was going to ask if Claire and Dan could maybe go through, top 10 things that farmers might want to be looking for on a potentially daily basis, like dung scoring, etc. But it sounded like Claire was going to come in and do that anyway, so they're ahead of the game.
We go down to that bit on the.
Yeah, click down.
Sorry, I'm just going to see. Let me just click up here. We'll go on to that. So I mean, it's probably worth we can carry on with this bit. So, what is an indicator disease? Which I think Dan was going to talk a little bit about. And then, diseases that we might see as indicators. So, and what we might look for early signs as well.
Yeah, it sort of links in, I think, Nikki, to your point there, maybe about the top 10 type of things, but there is, and it's reiterating the same point that we've all made in different ways, but I think it's so important that there is no substitution for observation. The first point is observation and then interpretation, and the interpretation bit can be hard. I always tell farmers that cows know everything, they tell us everything. Our challenge is interpreting what they're telling us. And so if we start with the observation side of things, and in the case of ringworm, that will be obviously of the integumentary system, the skin, but a lot of the time the phone call will be the same. So Dan, I've got some ringworm. What should we do about it? What should we treat it with? Whereas to Claire and I, that's a sign of something else going on. That's a sign of the imbalance not being right. So in the case of ringworm, obviously a fungal infection, but it requires a solid immune system to deal with encountering that fungus. And selenium is incredibly important for the immune system. The immune system is actually really, really hungry. So when Claire was talking before about thermoneutral zones, if a calf is requiring a lot of energy to stay warm, it diverts energy away from what is an otherwise energy hungry system, the immune system, to try and keep warm, and so suddenly we see more disease there. And the other thing that's really crucial for skin integrity and resilience is zinc. So that's where I start to look if we're seeing these sorts of things, not where has that ringworm come from or what do we treat it with, but why is that animal unable to deal with ringworm, to produce the two cases that we have here. The one on the left, the calf, is healing, but if you look at that cow on the right, yes, it's a dairy cow, and you can quite clearly see it's a housed dairy cow, but that she just stayed still while I took the photo. But you can see how bad her active ringworm is. So that would be an example there of something we might look at.
Sorry, I'm trying to do the slides and I'm not doing a great job, people.
So eyes are a big one, and we talk about them a lot. There's several things I like. Nutrition and minerals is one, and I really like eye things as well. So if you combine those two things together, then I'm dead happy. So going back to your point, Nikki, about some of the top 10 things, for me, when you go and look at a group of animals, whether they be inside or outside, one of the first areas I would always look is eyes. And so I'd be looking to see if we have any discharges there, and some really early discharges will be the beginning signs of an awful lot of diseases. I'd be looking to see the position of those eyes in the head. So you guys will all know about that, one of the first signs we might see an animal that's ill would be he or she becomes dehydrated. There's a massive fat pad that sits behind the eye. As soon as that becomes dehydrated, the eye sinks. And what we tend to see there, that Claire is showing in these photos, is the upper eyelashes give a really good indication of the position of the eye. So if you look at our adult cow on the left-hand side, can you see how her upper eyelashes are almost pointing up slightly, and they're both symmetrical? So her eye is occupying a nice position within her head. She's not dehydrated. If she was, then we'd see both of those eyelashes dropping. And if we look at our poor calf on the other side, you can see that actually it's not the best photo, but those eyelashes aren't symmetrical. So if we're looking at eye disease in one eye versus the other, you will see that the eyelashes on one side drop down. And that's not because of dehydration, because it's asymmetric. It's because the eye is painful in that side. And so the animal responds by pulling the eye back into the head. And sometimes before you start to see the eyelids closing together, you will see this asymmetry of the eyelashes. And so in your top 10, skin would definitely be one. Eyes, eye position, discharges from the eyes would be another. And so you can talk about what disease that might be and how you might treat it. But along those discussions, Claire and I would want to go all the way back to, right, well, what is that telling?
That eye on the right hand side in that younger animal as well actually probably looked normal from the outside, but it's literally the eyelashes in that photo, isn't it? That was that was the first change.
And so when we went to see that client, that was a distant client actually that we go and visit a couple of times a year. When we went to see that client, we were talking a lot about eye problems and the eyes that he was perhaps presenting. He dealt with a local vet for his day-to-day stuff. The eyes that he was perhaps presenting for that vet to look at, and they've discussed all sorts of different treatments, were the ones that were quite a way gone, because by that time anybody could walk in and identify those animals had an eye problem. But going back to Nikki's point, Neil's point, Penn's point, it's an observation and going in and spotting things before they get to that point and before you need that dramatic treatment. So eyes is a really nice example of that, how you can just tune your observation in ever so slightly, and you can pick things up a hell of a lot earlier.
It can all, a lot of these diseases, as well as indicator diseases, can also be a bit of an idea that there might be something else going on within your herd or your flock. So, for example, if you're getting a lot of eye disease or consistently over years, you could start, infectious diseases. So things like BVD in cattle, for example, it does cause immunosuppression. So if there's any BVD or things in your herd, for example, they're much more likely to pick up other diseases. And there's been a bit of work done now, hasn't there, looking at TB. So BVD infected herds are going to be more likely to be infected with TB just because of that level of immunosuppression that it causes. So yeah, it can often be a sign that there's other things going on. Am I still jumping up there? Look. Sorry. Is this the?
So yeah,
We can hear you. We'll ignore the jumping.
Okay, good.
Looks like we're dancing around the place, which we're not. And so this was just another nice photo of that. So you can see on the, rather than say left and right, you can see on the side where the calf has the large ear tag, how droopy the eyelashes are on that side. So that's quite a nice example of that. And there was actually really early watery discharge there as well. And so when we're looking at, to give you sort of it in the round, when we're looking at those sorts of cases, Claire and I will be talking to the clients about what the mineral levels are. And one thing Penn talked about when we had a conversation earlier in the week is how we might measure those. We would also be looking at what the fly burdens are and how we might control those with natural methods and what the ecosystem is doing. So it's linking all of those things up together.
So how would you test minerals in the stock, and when would you do it?
So there's lots of different arguments about when, where, and how to test them. So obviously you've got your end user testing, which is in your animal. And that is quite nice because it tells you levels that they are getting, but you can take it back to levels in the herbage. So just going along and taking bits of pasture as if you were grazing and then testing for minerals in that. And then you can go to the next point and test in the soil. And we would utilize all of those. But if we're talking about the animal, frustratingly, none of these things are simplistic. So some mineral tests that we would be doing would be testing for what the mineral was on that day or in that week. So iodine is quite a good example of that. Whilst it sits in the thyroid, you can get pretty good ideas of what active iodine levels are there at the minute. But things like selenium, frustratingly, we're sort of, if we're testing through blood, we're testing what that selenium level was 6 weeks ago. And so you'll often take a lot of these samples at once and then have to interpret them ever so slightly differently, depending on exactly what it is we're testing, and also whether we're testing a pure mineral like iodine or we're testing a proxy in the case of selenium, where we would test the selenium containing enzyme. But it's quite nice because it sort of flows onto that picture of the liver there, which is a really useful organ for testing things like copper, selenium and cobalt, because that would be our main storage organ. And we can do that in biopsies in the live animal, or we can utilize slaughterhouse information, which is brilliant. And if you work closely with your slaughterhouse, so I've had conversations with a few, you say, right, we've got some animals coming in on Tuesday. Could you grab me 6 samples of liver, hold them, I will come, or I'll send you the envelopes and you can send them off to a lab. And that's brilliant because you don't necessarily need to do any more work for that, but you can utilize some information that is there, but otherwise you wouldn't have. So that can be really useful, Pen, that can, liver from cull animals.
I think one thing I always say as well, regardless if you guys have animals unfortunately that die on farm, a post-mortem examination is pretty much invaluable. You can learn so much. So if you want to spend money on something, I can't tell you how valuable they are. There's so many things you can see visually your vet can do. And obviously you can send them away to the VLA or somewhere to do them, but actually an on-farm post-mortem is a very, very useful thing, whether it's sheep, cattle, goats, pigs or chickens. Really useful to pick out some quite often obvious problems, particularly with things like parasites, for example.
Or to remove,
don't ever let a dead animal go to waste completely.
or it might exclude from something and mean that you're not treating animals unnecessarily for something.
Yeah.
If it's there. Yeah. Well, we're down to the last 5 minutes before hopefully DEFRA turn up. I haven't had any message. I don't think I've got any messages telling me that they're struggling to get in, and they'll be here shortly. So if you have, have we got Deb Howe asking a question? Can you send liver samples just to local vets, or do they have to be sent off to specialist labs from abattoir samples?
They'd go from your vet to a specialist lab. So there is more labs doing it. We've sent all our liver samples to New Zealand because we could get them to New Zealand and the results back before we could for any of the UK labs, which was a bit of a sorry state of affairs, but it has improved in the UK. So there's a few labs that we would send liver samples to, but they would tend to go through your vet, to get there. Or we have with some slaughterhouses dealt with them, and they will send them the packaging stuff and they'll send it direct to the lab. So there is options, but it wouldn't be something that you vet would test. They'd have to send it away somewhere.
So in the last few minutes, Dan and Claire, is there anything you want to round up with that people should take up? I mean, observation. I've taken away observation and early observation and really understanding your animals as key. Maybe talking to your vet about that. I mean, obviously we're coming into talking to the guys, DEFRA for those in England on there's going to have the opportunity of really having a conversation with the vets. But what would you be your sort of take-home messages to the folk on the call here?
I think Claire's point before about having the conversation with your vet about what you want to achieve as a starting point is really good, and that will help identify whether you feel you've got a vet who is talking your language and is going to help you get there or not. But sharing the objectives for your business, whether that might be I want to finish a certain number of cattle off grass, or I want to have a healthy group of animals that require minimal inputs, any of those things. Your vets can help you get there, but only if you have that conversation about what it is you want to achieve and what your objectives are. We are guilty of assuming we know what your objectives are. So that is a criticism of vets more than a criticism of farmers.
I think for me, so going back to observation as well, some of these things, these measurements here can be really useful for you guys, just only not taking them every single day, but looking at them over time. So things like cleanliness scoring, I mean, the AHDB is obviously for a dairy system, but it still gives you a good indication. Obviously, things like body condition scoring, and you guys can learn to do this online yourselves, or you can work with your vets, monitoring what your body condition's doing over time. Rumen fill scoring, so actually you're looking at the left-hand side of the animal. They've got a little triangle at the back, it's called the sublumbar fossa, but I prefer a little triangle. And seeing how that fills and changes over time throughout the course of the day, when they move on to new pasture, when they come off, that can be a good early indication if rumen fills are consistently low before you start losing body condition. So dung scoring as well, there's definitely things online there as well you can look at, but a really, a good quality, and listening to what cows poo. So a good poo sounds like a really slow hand clap. So thinking about, hearing, listening for sounds. So coughing, has something changed over time? Looking at coats, when we've got big open coats, there can be an indication that something's going on if they're not losing their coats properly in the spring. Just that consistent monitoring. If people can do weights, actual weights, that can be really useful if you have weigh scales doing that throughout the season. And then mobility scoring as well. You can look at, there's so many videos online to pick up lame cows, Sometimes it's very, very subtle. Just remembering our cattle and our sheep, they're prey species, so they don't want to show you that they're lame. But having a look, definitely, there's lots of resources out there to use as well. And yeah, there we go. Sorry.
Well, that's brilliant. Martin from DEFRA has now joined us. Thank you very much, Martin. I've made you a co-host, so you can present your own slides if you want, or I can present them for you, whichever you prefer. Martin, hi. I'll come on. Thank you, Claire and Dan. I was fascinated. I hope everyone else was. I certainly enjoyed the conversation. It was maybe an indulgence on my part, but thank you so much for taking the time for that. It was great. So Martin is I say, is from Future Farming in DEFRA. He is going to, there's the new animal health and welfare pathway, of which the animal and health and welfare review with your vet or with a vet, it doesn't have to be your own vet, I understand, is part of that. And you might want to think about which vet you want to use based on what Dan and Claire have been saying earlier on. But Martin, I'll hand over to you. Hopefully you can share your screen, or if not, as I say, I can share mine.
If you're able to share your screen, that would be really, really helpful to me. Sorry, I'm having a small problem with one of the files at the moment, so apologies for that.
That's fine. Can hopefully they can see that now. Can you see? Yes,
it's on my screen, okay? So
yeah, no, I can see it here. So I'll just tell me when you want me to move to the next slide.
well, that's really appreciated. So yeah, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, that'd be fantastic. So hi everyone, thanks very much for inviting me along to come and talk to you this evening. My name is Martin Jenkins. I head up policy for Future Farming for Healthier Animals, Better Enforcement, and also the Animal Health and Welfare Board for England. What I'd like to do is talk to you about the Animal Health and Welfare Pathway, some of the elements within that, particularly the Annual Health and Welfare Review. And really the best place to start is the beginning. So right at the centre is this vision of universal delivery of healthier, higher welfare animals across our farm. So we want healthier, higher welfare animals. But that needs to be done in partnership with an awful lot of people. So rather than doing what government can sometimes do, which is sit down and think this is what's going to be the right solution for everybody, instead we've put at the absolute centre of how we've done this what we call co-design, which is basically sitting down with farmers, vets, scientists, representative organisations, people with real skin in the game, real sort of lived experience, and designing our policy with them rather than doing it to them. So having this idea of a better partnership between government and industry is really important, and having that, really using that key partnership between farmers and their vets, again, really, really important part of what we're doing. And, there's lots of good reasons to produce healthier, higher welfare animals. A bunch of them are on the screen here, but there's some really big benefits we can deliver along, lines of productivity and trade, but also the environment by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, better for public health through better use of medicines and reducing antibiotic use. It's more cost effective. It really meets our national values. But also it's really about food production. It's about food security, giving better choices to consumers, and really trying to set out England and the UK as being, a really world leading place when it comes to the quality of our livestock and the food that we produce from our livestock and other goods as well. Would you mind moving along another one, please? Thanks very much. So this really kind of articulates what that co-design is about. So having vets at the core of how we've designed this, really using the really trusted relationship that lots of farmers and vets share, and creating a better opportunity for those farmers that are already working really closely with their vet to do more, and helping those farmers who maybe don't see a vet as regularly as they might like to be able to tap into that advice and support to help them deliver better health and welfare on their farm. So we've been co-designing capital grants, endemic disease and condition control programs, our annual health and welfare review, but also looking at how we can really tailor things to individual farms. So it's not a sort of one size fits none approach, but we can make this as bespoke as possible while delivering something on a national basis. Pen, would you mind going to the next one as well? Thank you. So the pathway itself has got 3 pillars. So the one we'll mostly be talking about today is the first one, which is financially rewarding farmers for delivering enhancements around health and welfare. But that goes alongside stimulating market demand, so making it easier for consumers to purchase higher welfare products and, you know, commanding a better price for those products because that welfare is properly recognised by the market and consumers. But also it's about strengthening the regulatory baseline. So that's about better performance, better compliance. It's about sort of raising up those that maybe aren't meeting the standards as well as they should be. It's about improving those standards over time, but it's also about making the way that we enforce fairer. So moving away from cross-compliance, for example, which is obviously seen as not very effective and pretty unfair in lots of circumstances. So trying to move towards a regime that's more about sort of early redirection towards doing the right thing rather than solely looking at kind of punishment and often disproportionate punishment. Can we move on to the next one, please, Pen? So when it comes to those sort of funded elements, for most farmers, we'd expect the first step on the pathway to be the annual health and welfare review. And I have to apologise, I have not updated end of 2022. That should be end of January 2023. So apologies for that. But the plan there is for a vet or a vet-led team to come out to a farm on an annual basis, do a review of health and welfare, really focused on kind of meaningful change for that farm. And of course, that would then sort of signpost other forms of support, which might be health and welfare grants, so capital investments for equipment, tech, infrastructure, but also disease eradication and control programs, so further diagnostic testing, vet advice, looking at biosecurity, that sort of thing. And then lastly, payment by results. So results-based funding for improvements in health and welfare as well. So you can see the kind of broad timelines over that. Can we move on to the next one, please? Thanks very much. So digging into the health and welfare review in a little bit more detail. So there's a minimum threshold around the number of animals that an applicant needs to have, a keeper needs to have. And then from applying, there's 6 months in which to sort of do all the different activities. We're trying to keep this as simple as possible. So the farmer and the vet would have a 2 to 3 hour review of health and welfare on the farm. That's really flexible. There's no checklist there. It needs to be about health and welfare, obviously including things like biosecurity, use of medicines and so on. But it's really for the farm and the vet together to decide where they want to focus their energies, where they want to focus their attentions. And that allows those reviews to be absolutely bespoke to the individual farms. So it's about that farmer, that vet, you know, on that kind of farm, using those production methods with those particular animals. And the farmer and the vet might be using that, for example, they might be in an assurance scheme and they might have identified some things to dig into in more detail, and they might use this time to go into a particular issue in more detail. Or it might be a farm that maybe hasn't seen a vet in a while, and in that case it might be much more broad, looking at, you know, some early investigation, identifying why some of the priorities on that farm might be. And it's also about delivering some sort of specific diagnostic testing on that farm. So in the case of pigs, that's PRRS. In the case of cattle, so beef or dairy, that's BVD. And in the case of sheep, it's worming treatment checks. After that, the vet and the farmer should be agreeing relevant actions for that farm to take, and signposting maybe grants, where grants might be able to give some support for undertaking those actions. I should say it's really important that's not an enormous list of every possible thing you know, that could happen on the farm, but it's supposed to be short, sharp, achievable, really focused. And again, After that stage, all of that will form part of a veterinary report that'll include the diagnostic testing results, it'll include other findings, recommendations, and so on. Really important to say, that report is never shared with DEFRA or government or RPA. That report stays between the farmer and the vet. And one of the reasons for that is to ensure that one of our key sort of pillars of this approach is this is not a backdoor inspection. This is not a way of, checking up on farmers or getting vets to check up on farmers. This is all about trusting the vet and the farmer to have a really good quality conversation. So not sat looking at documents around the kitchen table, but walking the farm, looking at the animals, really digging into the priorities for that farm. After the review, obviously I'd expect the vet's probably invoicing the farmer in some way. The farmer will be sort of submitting some very basic details at the initial stage, and then they'll be able to claim the funding. We aim to pay the funding within 28 days. Normally it should be much quicker than that. It's designed to be as straightforward as it possibly can be. And this review will be opening up. We've been testing since September, but it'll be opening up for kind of more formal expressions of interest to anyone who's a BPS recipient from the end of January. At that stage, you'll be able to apply only for one review per single business identifier, so per SBI for the farm. Over time, relatively quickly, we will remove the BPS restriction so that everyone with a sufficient number of animals can apply. Over time, we will then also be introducing the ability to have multiple reviews each year, where you've got multiple herds or flocks. So for example, if you've got a beef herd and a sheep herd, you'll be able to have 2 reviews. Or alternatively, if you've got two epidemiologically distinct beef herds, you'd be able to have 2 beef reviews, 1 for each of those herds. And then again, over time, we'll start asking for a little bit more information from the farmer. So for example, the diagnostic testing results, a little bit more information about the herd. And that's really all about helping us to understand the health and welfare of the national herds, the national flocks. And that will help us both in terms of sort of trade conversations, that really kind of arms the chief veterinary officer with better information. But it's also really helpful for us in terms of sort of delivering future policy, understanding what's going to be most useful, and also evaluating how effective the review and other kind of financial reward approaches are going. Really important, you can see at the bottom, it's all about being really flexible, not having a checklist, making sure the farmer and the vet decide what they want to prioritize. I'm sorry, Pen, you were absolutely right to move on. I just changed my mind at the last minute. Can we go on to the next one, please? Thanks very much. So as I said, specific tests depending on species, a little bit more information about the impact of these diseases. We know how important it is for farmers to have some support with these endemic diseases, not only because it's really worth spending public money on, because of the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, the environment, antimicrobial resistance, but also because it will deliver some real benefits on farm in terms of driving better productivity, but also because actually, diseases spread. We've got opportunities here where we could move towards control eradication. That's absolutely the intention for BVD and PRRS in particular. But also we know there needs to be some coordination for that to happen. So having something that's available to all, and more can join over time, and then having a follow-on sort of endemic disease eradication control programs coming on and building what we learn in the review will be really important. Can we move to the next one, please? Great. So these are the payment rates for different species. The thing that normally leaps out to people is they are different amounts. I should immediately say this is a payment for a review, not per animal in the herd or flock. I have had that question before. The reason for the different amounts is that the amount of time from the vet and the farmer to take samples and then the cost of the test itself is different depending on species, depending on type of test. You'll note that the payments for beef and dairy cattle are different. That's because in beef cattle, we're asking for check tests, so obviously blood samples, whereas in dairy, we're looking for bulk milk. So there's a difference in the amount of time that will be required to take the samples and, of course, the cost of the testing. Can we move on to the next one? Thanks very much. So as I said, we started testing this back in September. We had a really good cohort of 400 farmers and their vets. We're opening more widely later this month. We've had some good feedback. We've made some good changes as a result of that, though obviously having vets and farmers involved since the very inception of the policy and in developing the policy and then what we deliver has kind of really helped with this. And we've had some great feedback from vets and farmers that have said they could really tell vets and farmers have been involved in putting this together. We've tried to keep the guidance really flexible, really simple and straightforward, and really try and get government out of the way and not sort of telling farmers and vets how to do things, but giving them the tools and giving them opportunities to do more and do it really well as collecting some of this information on a national basis. Would you mind moving to the next one? Thanks very much. So I think that's everything that I was going to run through on the presentation. So Pen, happy if you want to take that off screen. Really happy to take any questions. I will put a slight warning that there are some questions that I know have a bit of nuance or a bit complex, and I'm not a vet myself, so occasionally I might need to say I'll take that away and come back to you, but happy to go through anything you'd like to ask. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Martin. That was a great overview. It was really helpful, and thanks also for coming in at very short notice on a Thursday evening. I know you had to make some changes to do this for us, so it really is appreciated. I have a question. If the farmer already knows things like their drench tests for their sheep, or already knows their BVD status, can they use it for another kind of testing? Or
yeah, so it's a great question and it's come up before. So a couple of things. So the first is we've tried to standardize things as far as possible so that there's a simple single payment rate for each species, rather than having people needing to pick from a whole suite of different options. So the money does need to be used for that specific test. However, what we've heard from lots of people is, you're not only going to do one drench test and then never do it again. So actually for some people, that funding might cover the cost of something they were planning to do anyway in the coming year. So they might already be planning to do some BVD testing in that year. So we'd say, great, make sure you're doing your review about that time, do the BVD testing as part of that. Great, you can use the government funding to pay for it. That might then free up some money for you to do something else, test for something else. So I think probably in practical terms, yes, you can end up using that money elsewhere, but actually it needs to be spent on the thing that we're paying for, which is part of the joy of rules around how we use and kind of articulate government spending.
So yeah, do Dan and Claire, one of you who put your hand up, do you want to come in and ask what?
Cheers, Ben. Yeah, that'd be good. Thank you, Martin. Obviously, we've been hearing bits about the process for a little while, so it's good to hear some more details on that. My question may be a difficult one to answer and isn't actually necessarily related to the vet involvement in it, but one of the pillars of DEFRA's approach to the future farming is the buy-in from the consumer and getting the consumer to value and pay for higher health and welfare reared livestock in the UK. I'm really interested, and maybe the guys attending it would be as well, to know a bit more about how DEFRA see that as panning out. There's so much research in the past that talks about people valuing it when they are asked, and then behaviours of retailers or behaviours of consumers when they are buying, particularly in current circumstances, can change. So it would be great to learn a bit more about how DEFRA see that coming through.
Yeah, so that's not one that I can go into a lot of detail on, I'm afraid. Not because I'm not happy to, but because I don't know enough of the detail and there's a risk that I steer you wrongly. I would say there was a call to evidence. I think maybe sort of December 2021, if memory serves me, looking at welfare labelling for animal products. So that's one of the things that we've been looking at quite carefully around how can we really show consumers that they have a really high degree of confidence that particular products have been produced to a particularly high standard, so that those can command a better price, from consumers and through retailers. I mean, exactly as you raised, this is really complex. And getting it to work properly is not going to be easy and straightforward. But I know one of my colleagues elsewhere in the team who's more focused on the welfare side, her team's leading an awful lot of work to do with that, and it's something we're really sort of dedicated to, because actually, if you think about spending public money on better welfare, well, if the consumer will pay more of that, then government pays less of that. Which is, I think, a good result, because most people would like to be getting the price at the farm gate and through the supply chain rather than having to go through government.
Brilliant, thank you. So in case of sort of watch this space a little bit, it'll be an interesting thing to see how it pans out.
Absolutely.
So we've got a couple of questions in the chat, one that came as a direct message and one that's open. One asks, is the number of animals or percentage of the herd defined? And I think you do have a minimum number of animals in the herd, but it's quite low, isn't it? It's something like,
it's really low. Yeah, it's more than 50 pigs, more than 20 sheep, more than 10 cattle. So, and that's at the time you carry out the review. So noting people's, herds, flocks, sometimes go up and down. We've deliberately set it quite low because we want everyone who's a commercial farmer to be able to be involved. And that includes, say, for example, primarily arable farmers who happen to also keep some livestock, really keen for them to get involved as well. Or for people who, so for example, we did a review for someone who actually primarily kept sheep, but happens to have a small pig herd, and they'd never really bothered getting veterinary advice about their pigs. They're quite forward looking and all that kind of stuff. So they decided to do the review for their pigs because they were really interested in starting to develop a kind of better vet relationship and kind of understand what they could do to improve the health and welfare for that group of animals who they were really passionate about, but wasn't where they were earning their money.
so sorry, the question was actually, how many do you need to test? I imagine that's between the vet and the farmer to decide.
It's set out in the requirements, so that'll all be published. I'm struggling to remember off the top of my head. In pigs, I have a feeling it's 30. In cattle, I think it's 12. Or 2 groups of 6, and in sheep I have a feeling it's 12 as well. Please don't absolutely quote me on that, but it's in that sort of ballpark if I'm slightly off.
And the next question is, please could you explain the funding, particularly for those not receiving BPS?
Yeah, absolutely. So those that aren't eligible for BPS won't be able to kind of join in when we first open it at the end of this month, but they will be able to quite soon after. You'll do the normal thing of kind of, saying, yes, I'm a farmer, here's my details, logging in, register, sort of applying. You'll then carry out the review. You'll come back in, you'll say, I've had my review, I've had my results. Here's the name of the vet that did it. Here's their RCVS number. Here's a unique identifier for the testing that was carried out. Please pay me. And then the payment will get sent to your bank.
There's another question I don't think is relevant for you because it's relating. It says here, but I'll read it anyway. It's a long-going issue with people who are doing direct sales, but there's no mention of welfare issues created by fewer abattoirs, meaning long distances for animals to travel. Does DEFRA have a view on this? I would say DEFRA does have a view on this, but it's outside this particular review, would be my comment.
You're right, Penn. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think this isn't a space where financial incentives are necessarily going to be the best answer. So I'm afraid I'll have to cry off that one with apologies.
Well, I mean, actually, I mean, I would say that financial incentives, but going to the abattoirs to encourage them and to, you know, but it's a different thing outside of this pathway review,
Yeah,
unfortunately, but which is a large separate expression, and it's a difficult one to address. I should say I have an interest. I sit on the Animal Welfare Committee, so I do hear some of this discussion anyway. So that's why I'm sort of coming in a bit on that. But I'll back away quickly. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to ask Martin or Mark, who's also joined the meeting now? Any hands going up? Any comments? Do unmute yourself if you do, if you don't want to put in the chat. I think what you've given us is a really clear overview of what's coming, and I think it's a great opportunity. As we were talking earlier with regenerative vets and potentially that they could potentially come in, not necessarily Claire or Dan, but doing consultant work out something and then going back and talk to their own vets who might not understand how some of our farmers are working. You know, there are opportunities there of really bringing up the health and welfare of the animals and getting discussions going, because I know that getting the vets onto the land to test my animals is very expensive. It's not something yeah. Unless we've got Ellen Vets up again asking another question. Do you want to come in, Dan or Claire?
No, I was just going to ask with regards to farms that already currently do like herd or flock health planning. Is this to help with that? So for Red Tractor, for example, or is it a completely separate form of planning? How does that?
Yeah, so I would say this isn't the same as a health plan. It could be doing some of the job of a health plan, but it's not the same thing. So what we want is this to build on what people are already doing. So for some people, they might not be doing much of anything. So this is really designed to kind of give them a start and, you know, start looking at some of the critical issues and so on. For people that are already doing things, so for example, people part of an assurance scheme, so say Red Tractor, you know, as part of health planning, they will be identifying things that they'd like to improve and, you know, developments to make. Also, as part of Red Tractor, it's quite assurance focused. It's about demonstrating that someone's, you know, complying to a set of standards. The review's different to that. It's not about demonstrating compliance. It's about digging in more detail. So what you might do is take what you find in a Red Tractor assurance visit or in the health planning, and you might use, you know, the funding available for the review to then dig in more deeply. So that's kind of the intention behind it. We've had some really good conversations with colleagues in Red Tractor as well, who really kind of see this in the same way. So I think there's a really big opportunity for vets here to really set out to their clients that actually, you know, we've identified these things in this Red Tractor visit. You can tap into extra government funding so we can spend more time delivering some good outcomes around the issues that we've identified, you know, through a Red Tractor health plan or whatever it is. You know, I think vets really are a critical part of making this work. It's really important to say that, but equally farmers being really open to a different way of doing things or having you know, making the most of the opportunity, I think is really important. It's great to come along to groups like this and talk about, you know, the pathway generally, the review specifically, but actually the thing that will make this work and get people interested is farmers having conversations with each other, farmers having conversations with their vets, and, you know, hopefully people getting involved, seeing that it works and then telling other people it works. That's going to be much more convincing than, you know, me coming along and talking to you.
Thank you. Well, as we're coming up to 8:30 now, I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to say thank you to Martin and for Mark for coming on quietly in the background from DEFRA to give us that, because as I say, this new scheme's coming on. Hopefully we'll all be able to make use of it, and if not straight away, then in the up and coming. And thanks once again fantastically for Dan and Claire for your insights and conversation. I personally have really enjoyed it. Takeaway observation is key. And thanks very much. So I'll say good night. Have a nice evening for what's left of the evening. Go out and get a beer or something, walk your dogs. The next webinar I think is next week on goats, for those who are interested in goaty questions. So have a good evening and take care, and bye.